How to recondition your lower back, hip joint, and hips when you sit long periods of time. Let's start with your pelvis. When your pelvis is stuck down here, this creates a really tense lower back. But not only that, it also can cause problems in the legs and in the hip joints. So you don't want your pelvis to be really stuck back and down right here, but really you do want to use your sitting bones to aim your pelvis up along with your head and your spine. Raise it up and let the pelvis rise above your legs, not down but up towards the head. When you rise up with your pelvis, you can hinge yourself forward and backward like this with your pelvis, and not from your lower back but from the hip joints, which brings us to the hip joint. When you raise your pelvis up and it's light and not collapsing down into your hip joints, the hip joints become free to move, and you can really hinge yourself from the joint and not from the lower back, which will look like this. I'm moving from the lower back and my pelvis is stuck down under. I don't want that condition. This creates lower back pain, joint issues, leg issues, sciatica, all of these problems. I really want to find my sitting bones, which are the bottom edges of the pelvis. Take my pelvis and my head and my back up, and then I can hinge myself forward and backward from the hip joint. Don't worry about the shape of your back. Your back does not need to be straight, okay? You can have freedom from any kind of form of your back, especially when you sit. When you sit, most people have their arch too small and their back is too straight when sitting. When we raise the pelvis up and we let the pelvis undo tension from the hip joints, you get your natural arch, which is good. This is open. And then you can hinge yourself forward and back. So this is the pelvis. Now, the legs. We don't want the legs to be stuck to the sides. This is a very common condition that creates pain in the sides of the legs, but also in the lower back and in the hip joints. So we really want our legs to be loose, ready to move, able to move. We don't want to sit on them. We don't want them to be stuck. We want them to be loose and free from the hip joint. After you raised your pelvis and you let your legs be loose and free, you can feel the exact position of the hip joint with your fingers. Okay, it's right there. It's not on the sides of the leg, it's on the insides of the leg, okay, right here. So feel if you have any kind of string that is too dense or too tense. We really want the hip joint to be loose and free and be a place of separation, of free separation between the legs and the torso. How can you release your hip joint? With a couple of simple movements. First of all, when you sit, you can take a turnout like this and try to create a simple motion from the hip joint, right and left. Just move your leg to the right and to the left. This is a movement, a classic movement of the hip joint. And doing this movement creates better flow and releases the hip joint. As long as you keep the first two rules, let your pelvis rise up with your back. Therefore, you do not collapse on the hip joint. And the second rule is letting your legs be free. Therefore, you allow movement in the hip joint. Repeat in both legs. The second movement is similar and will help us understand the alignment of the legs created by the hip joint. So we can sit in a parallel position or in a turnout position, whatever you want to call it, but we really want to have the ability to move our legs in all kinds of positions, and the movement comes from the hip joints. We raise ourselves up and we allow this type of motion. We can sit like this. We can create a different angle. The purpose here is to understand that the hip joint creates all kinds of alignment, and we are connecting with the hip joint mentally and physically when we create these different types of alignments in our legs. Now let's create mobility and movement in the hip joint standing up. So the first motion we can do is this motion. Remember that the hip joints have a really large range of motion, okay? It's a really large range of motion, a rounded range of motion. We can do almost 180 degrees of motion with the hip joint, theoretically. So start by creating this type of motion and really point to yourself that the hip joint is here, in this place right here, and move your legs, grounding on the biggest toe. The other leg. The other motion you can do is just, again, raising your head and torso and pelvis up and just releasing your knees and the hip joint forward, doing, looks like walking in place, but really what I'm doing here is just releasing the hip joint while raising myself up, releasing the knees and the hip joint together, alternating the legs. Now get back to sitting and feel your hip joint with your fingers. Try to see if this stringy feeling got looser after you did all these motions. Feel both sides of your hip joint and see if things are more relaxed. So let's sum things up. We started by releasing the pelvis from this position, releasing it up, releasing ourselves from any conception of correct posture, just raising the pelvis up. Then we talked about the legs, creating freedom of movement in the legs while still aiming ourselves up. With the hip joint right in the middle, right here, the upper part of the body raises above the hip joint and the legs release below the hip joint. Therefore, we create freedom in the joint itself. Two more comments. First of all, you don't have to sit like this all the time. People change positions of sitting, but if you sit in the normal way like this, you really want to keep these things in mind and in your body. Second is, when you use a backrest, these things behave the same, just like this. We talked about raising the pelvis up, and when I use a backrest, I just keep on raising it up, and then I hinge it backward. Okay, it looks like this. The actual raising or growing along the spine creates connection that allows me to do this tilt with the pelvis and the spine together. And when I use a backrest, I can just rest. I take my sitting bones all the way back and just use a backrest as I sit with the pelvis still growing. It doesn't matter that the position of the back tilted forward or tilted backward, the pelvis still raises along towards the spine. Thank you for being here. Hope this helps, and I'll see you in the next video.